All right, folks, let's pick up here with the second lecture on the Civil War. And just make this a little more centered here. Okay, in the previous lecture, we discussed the larger context of conflict from the 1850 to 1871. In this lecture, we're going to look at opening conditions of the war. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to put together two lectures that I have materials on, and I have done in the past, but I don't have formal presentation on. One is the election of 1860 and the different secession movements, and the second is the comparison between Lincoln's cabinet and Davis's cabinet, which is a good way of getting sort of a top-down view of the different ways in which the Union and Confederacy functioned. I do have some readings on that, which for this class I will post, but seeing it visually is not a bad thing. Unfortunately, don't have that now. I did have a presentation on the cabinets, but I can't seem to find it. It might have been on a classroom computer that has since been wiped. In any case, let's move to opening conditions of the war at the point that war is looking virtually inevitable, and this would be after Fort Sumter in April of 61. If you're Lincoln and his cabinet and Davis and his cabinet, you need to have a long, sober set of discussions about what is feasible, what resources do you have, what does victory look like. One distinguishing feature of the American Civil War is that both sides fought this war at a very high level. If you track U.S. foreign policy and military affairs for the last 10, 20 years, you will often notice a lot of complaining confusion about the lack or relative lack of a clear sense of strategic vision, of understanding what the end goal of the war is supposed to be, and how to bring your different resources to bear to achieve that goal. The Civil War is notable by the fact that most commanders and certainly the heads of state are very clear on this. They can have arguments about how best to achieve things, but the sort of discussions you find of this sort of high-level policy and grand strategy, if you will, they're of a pretty high order, and they make fascinating reading. So let's start off here. Picking up from last time, one of these pictures is Nanjing in 1864, and the other one is Petersburg in 64. At least I've always understood the one that's Petersburg to be Petersburg. Though looking at it, some of it almost looks like around Vicksburg. But I'm pretty positive this is Petersburg. And if you're wondering, yes, the bottom right one is Petersburg. The battlefields that you see in Petersburg now, they're pretty overgrown. If you go to the crater today and Petersburg National Battlefield, the crater doesn't look very large. It's filled in a lot since, June 30th, 1864. I once had in a teacher ed course, I once had a student who was 93 years old, and she decided she wanted to take this course for the fun of it. And we went out to the crater, and she described how, when she went there as a little girl in the 30s, it was much bigger. This kind of gets across that at the end of the day, warfare looks roughly the same around the world. If you were to go to Denmark for the 1864 Prussian-Danish War, you would notice fortifications that look very similar to this as well. Okay. So, all right. Now, some of the animations on this don't work very well. I copied this comes from my time at West Point. This is where I got some of this data from. Let's take a look at population. Of course, the North has about 20 million. The South has about 9.1, 9.2 million. People. Of that number, nearly 4 million are enslaved. So the white southern population is in essence about 5 million, facing off against about 20 million people in the United States. So there's a major population imbalance. This doesn't look very promising. If you're the Confederacy, if you're the Lincoln administration, on surface this looks great. In practice, of course, mobilizing that number of people is very tricky, and you very well might not get the political cooperation you need to do that. All right. Now, of this population, what percentage are in towns? And notice that towns of 2,500 people and over, that's a good-sized town. About 27% of northern population is in these sort of towns. About 10% of southern population is. So, the Confederacy is much lower density of people per square mile. It's roughly the size of Western Europe. And a lot of their towns are fairly small. Percentage of labor force in agriculture, this is going to malfunction here in a moment. The North has roughly about maybe 37% in agriculture. The South is more like 70, roughly 75, more than 75% in agriculture. So, of course, a lot of this is going to be enslaved labor. I think they're counting cotton in agriculture there. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I think that's where those figures come from. Now, if you look at dollar value of farmland per acre, northern farmland is worth a lot more than southern farmland on average. And northern soil tends to be very, in many ways, quite richer. A lot of the best soil in the South has been reserved for cotton production. You can see this if you track sort of Indian removal and then where the major cotton production areas crop up. We do have maps of that, but not in this particular presentation. So the North is self-sufficient, essentially self-sufficient in this regard. Now, in terms of manufacturing, of course, the United States has a huge number of manufacturing establishments. We're not talking huge factories here necessarily. It could be a small concern of one or two people. It could even be cottage industry, right? So 1840s to 1860s, industrialization, especially, this is very much a European phenomenon, but this kind of applies to the U.S. as well in some ways. This is as much an issue of things happening in the home as in sort of centralized factories. So if you look at that number, you think, wow, that's an awful lot of manufacturing establishments. That would be why. Confederacy, they don't really have manufacturing establishments. But, from the southern states' perspective, they don't need to invest in that. Why would they? They can just buy or import what they need from the northern states. If you're Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, this is going to be one of your main concerns, because if you're going to fight a modern war, you need to be able to have manufacturers. In terms of capital invested in manufacturing, of course, the North has a lot more capital invested, and that makes sense. This is going to impact not just manufacturing, but also infrastructure. And this leads to a much bigger point that I will get to in a moment. This is probably my favorite image here. Pig iron, which is kind of your, the raw component you need for gun barrels, cannon barrels, just anything to do with munitions. This figure is for Pennsylvania alone. This is one reason why Pennsylvania is so important to the Northern war effort. And then finally, rail. This is going to malfunction. It's going to disappear. But essentially, the North has about 23 to 25,000 miles of track. The Confederacy only has about 11,000, somewhere between 9 to 13,000. I can't remember the exact figure. And not all of those are the same gauge. and we'll see this in a moment. So if you are the Confederacy, you're facing some pretty big challenges. You have declared that you have the right to secede. The various secession commissions have convinced the state legislatures, although there is some talk that the Georgia Secession Convention was manipulated so they would vote for secession. You convinced them by hook or by crook to leave the United States. They've claimed the right to leave. And now you have to set about creating a new nation. There's a lot of talk of this being a second American Revolution. The North is going to talk about this as well. This is sort of Lincoln's a new birth of freedom. The South, of course, the Confederacy, does a couple things right off the bat. Number one, the Constitution of the Confederacy does not allow secession, which is an interesting thing. It kind of underlines Lincoln's point to Congress in July 4th, 1861, when he says no government can actually admit that its component parts have a right to secede. You can't actually run a democratic government that way, because then there's no legal or philosophical means to stop endless fragmentation. The Confederacy knows that very well, so that's one of the things they put in the Constitution. There are no political parties in the Confederacy. This is regarded by the Confederate framers of the Confederate Constitution as being an improvement. This is going back to what Washington and Adams wanted, and preventing the rot that set in with Hamilton versus Jefferson, Federalists versus Republicans. What this means, however, is that the Confederate government is run by faction. Vicious personal infighting, backbiting, personal prejudice, likes, dislikes, vendettas, and there's no way to channel that. We also do not know how the Confederate government would have handled, or the Confederacy itself would have handled, a presidential election, because Davis never finished his term. 1 6-year term is all that he's allowed to have. Would he have moved for an amendment to allow him to have another one? How would you even campaign? You can't campaign as with a party apparatus. So how would a presidential election have actually worked? We don't know. Lincoln, on the other hand, is part of this two-party system. He insists on they hold midterm elections in '62. They hold presidential election in '64, and Lincoln is under some pressure to postpone that election because of the war. They're in the midst of the war, and he says, no, this is going to go forward. So when you compare the way the two governments function, the Confederacy has some serious disadvantages. The other thing the Confederacy does is they continue this kind of authoritarian streak, and yes, Lincoln is often accused of this, but if you look at how the Confederacy runs, as Gary Gallagher has so often argued, it is a pretty hardcore authoritarian government. The Confederacy basically adopts the principle that it can interfere in anything and everything that its citizens do, whether or not they may think it correct. So this is captured fairly well in that recent movie Free State of Jones, where local citizens of the Confederacy are suffering routine acquisitions by Confederate officials of supplies, food, animals, and other stuffs for the war. This sort of thing does not really happen in the United States up north. Certainly nothing along this line or on this scale. In one sense, you could say this is, from a government perspective, this is justified because you're trying to create a whole infrastructure that doesn't exist. But it really does kind of kill off a lot of Confederate patriotism certainly as time goes on. And remember, there's an awful lot of people in all of these Confederate states who are pro-Union. The conventions may have been empowered to vote for secession and lead states out of the Union. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of people who voted against secession. So you have restive populations. You have a government which turns to increasingly authoritarian measures to create its infrastructure and keep its war effort going. This includes extending enlistments. Confederate volunteers who signed up for 1 year found their enlistments extended by another 2 years. And then when those were about to run out, the Confederate government extended them for the duration of the war. So if you're a Confederate soldier, the chances of you deserting at some point, either short term or because you've just had enough, are very high. In fact, desertion is the number one problem in the Confederate Army. This kind of undercuts that lost cause idea that Southern Confederate soldiers rallied to the Bonnie Blue flag and stood to arms with unwavering loyalty and devotion to do. No, that's absolutely not the case. There were an awful lot who did. Elite units were elite units for a reason. But desertion was the number one problem in the Confederate military. So if you're Jefferson Davis, you have an awful lot of issues to contend with. You also have to wrangle various state governments. The Lincoln administration, on the other hand, you have enormous resources. The problem is how to deploy them, because unlike the Confederacy, even though Lincoln has assumed war powers, the question exists, how do you actually wield war powers? And at the end of the day, you still are living in a Republican form of government. Not party, but as in lowercase r. You still have a democratic republic, and you have to work with that. That means states will get their own people appointed as generals, which means your generals are probably not going to be as good. You're dealing with people who, by and large, are not. They're not going to have some of the initial professional advantages, particularly, say, in cavalry. One of the other romantic notions about the Confederacy was that the Confederate cavalry were this elite fighting force, and they were the gallant cavaliers, this direct lineal descent from medieval knights and so on. A number of them certainly thought that. In matter-of-fact terms, the actual explanation for the effectiveness of Southern cavalry and their gradual ineffectiveness as time went on was very prosaic. Southern cavalry regiments were filled with men who owned their own horses. Now that meant that you probably were a much better rider than your northern counterparts who have a government-issued horse. You have a much closer connection to the animal, and you can function better. However, over time, this also means that your fighting efficiency is going to be degraded. A lot of Confederate cavalry units are going to be seriously under strength because you're also responsible for procuring your own remounts if something happens to your horse. And, of course, that initial advantage in terms of fighting prowess is going to get dulled as time goes on and casualties mount. So you'll see a degradation of fighting ability. Meanwhile, Union cavalry are just going to get better and better. By 1863, the two forces are about parallel. And certainly by 1864, Union cavalry is far superior, not just in terms of numbers, but also in terms of what they can execute. And you see this in the fact that, eventually Stuart's cavalry is sort of held at bay, even though, they do win after Stuart's killed in 64. Wade Hampton takes over the Battle of Trevelyan Station, which is up over here in Virginia, as well as, it's a notable for the way the Confederate cavalry is still handled. You have Joe Wheeler in Georgia, and of course you have Nathan Bedford Forrest, but Forrest is eventually defeated as well. As time goes on, these initial advantages of sort of elan and cohesion are going to level off and degrade, and then degrade. So that's sort of in a nutshell what Davis and his cabinet are dealing with. The issue of the cabinet I can't get into in great detail. I don't have all the material set up in front of me. But Davis's cabinet is very unstable. Their quartermaster, they go through 3 or 4 secretaries of war. You have the quartermaster, several, I think 2 or 3 of those. You have various key industrialists, including the people, the men behind the Tredegar Iron Works, various industrial bases in Georgia, northern Mississippi, and Alabama. You have a lot of rivalry and distrust. The secretaries of the Treasury, this is a thankless job, and they don't have. They have one good person there, good as in efficient, but it's just not very confidence building if you are familiar with the inner workings of the Confederate cabinet. Also, the Confederacy tends to not put its best people on the job when it comes to diplomacy. So very famously, of course, the Trent Affair, U.S. Navy vessels forcibly remove Confederate envoys to London from a British ship. The Brits get very angry at this. It actually would almost have been better if they just let the Confederate envoys go and not bother them, because these guys were not very competent. You see this many times. So the Confederacy's not particularly apt. Is that the opposite of inept, I wonder? When it comes to diplomacy, their cabinets beset by vicious infighting. It's a revolving door in terms of appointments in some key positions, like Secretary of War. They're dealing with fractious state officials. At the same time, they wield this kind of almost quasi-dictatorial power at times. You have a lot of Unionists who don't like this whole secession thing. There's nothing to do with them being anti-slavery, just they don't like the idea of secession. And then there's the military question, which is the strategy question. And this kind of gets to this question, this picture right here. Which is that for the Confederacy to win, they don't have to defeat the Union. They don't have to destroy the United States. They simply need a draw. The Confederacy wins if it draws. Because all they need is for the United States government to say, okay, fine, go. The United States government has a much harder task, which is why, with these 2 quotes are somewhat typical of what you're going to find from Confederate personnel. The George Wyeth Randolph says this in autumn of '61. Conquering the Confederacy is impossible. You may launch some raids on the coast, but you're not You may take you make some inroads in Tennessee, but you cannot conquer the Confederacy. It's too large. As long as we stay loyal to the cause, we don't have any problems. Beauregard, who's the initial commander of the Confederate Army, says that no people ever warred for independence with more relative advantages than the Confederates. And if we fail, then there's no point in any country trying to achieve independence through war. Fast forward to 1866, and everybody's very anxious to forget this. You already see put in motion the stories of overwhelming Union superiority. In fact, I think this is Pollard's The Lost Cause. I'd have to go back and check these figures. But for the 1864 campaign, he puts Lee's army at only 40,000 effectives, while Grant has 160,000 troops, which is absolutely ridiculous. The actual numbers were closer to 118,000 to 73,000. In other words, very, very much like the Gettysburg campaign. is basically the Gettysburg Campaign plus an additional corps brought over from Tennessee for the Union. But this is the sort of story that gets put out starting very quickly after the war and then reinforced by successive issues of the Journal of the Southern Historical Society papers, where a lot of Confederate generals talk, and it's basically how the Union had endless supplies of troops and men and munitions, and it was hopeless from the start, but we felt we had no choice. These two quotes are rather typical of what was thought in 61. So you got to read history forward. Again, as Gary Gallagher says, you read it forward, not backward, to recover that sense of contingency. Nobody sees Appomattox. It's not like secession happens. They circle. This is, again, to sort of take off on Gallagher's, some of Gallagher's talks. They circle April 9th, 1865, and they're counting down the days. Nobody does that. As far as they're concerned, they're going to win. And a lot of this comes down to their perceptions of the challenges that the Lincoln administration faces. Lincoln's cabinet is also fractious, but Lincoln's cabinet is ultimately very stable. A lot of this comes down to the character of Lincoln himself and his ability to handle his cabinet. They think they're going to manage him at the start of the war because he has no experience. His only experience was as an Illinois militia captain for a few months during the Black Hawk War in the 1830s. That's it. Jefferson Davis was not only an artillery captain who served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, he also had been Secretary of War. He'd managed the entire military policy of the United States. If you had to pick the two, you would have gone with Davis as your war chief. Lincoln has no experience. They think they're going to manage him. He checks out virtually every book from the Library of Congress on military affairs. And well before the end of the war, he's giving advice to his generals, and it's good advice. The enemy army is the main objective. I mean, this is, to those of us who do military history, this is like Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian theorist. You know, the objective is the enemy army. Forget the capital. You have to go for the enemy army. No, stop with the maneuvering, or stop with your concerns over here. Focus on the enemy. You have to fight. He's giving this advice, and he's done his reading. He's done his homework. But he has a fractious population. He has to deal with state governors. He has to deal with the creation of an army, just as Davis does. And also, Lincoln is under very severe, especially early on, severe limits as to what he can ask for. If he asks for 75,000 volunteers, now that's enough, after Sumter, that's enough to propel Virginia into seceding. But the enlistments for a number of these guys in 61 are due to run out in 64 if you sign up for a 3-year enlistment. Unlike the Confederacy, the United States government, when you finish your term, they can't make you. They can't make you continue. I mean, there is a draft that's instituted, and we see major draft riots, particularly in New York City. But, there's a number of veterans. 64 happens in the middle of campaigns. Well, their term is up. So you have to run a democratic army. Initially, companies will choose their own captains. This happens on both sides of the war. That nonsense kind of goes away. And there are some reasons for it, but the entire culture, military culture, you're dealing with people who are citizens. They're not citizen soldiers. They're citizens who are trying out to be soldiers. And you have a very small professional force, a big chunk of which has gone over to the Confederacy. So those are all problems. The biggest problem is that at the end of the day, the Lincoln administration, the United States government, can only win if it defeats and occupies the Confederacy. This is an immensely harder task than what the Confederacy has to do, even bearing in mind all the obstacles that the Confederate government faces in waging its own war. This means that you have to successfully invade and occupy an area the size of Western Europe. It means that you have to drop off garrisons of occupation, which means your field armies are going to be very weaker than it might look on paper. So yes, the Union may have a lot more armies at its disposal, but the actual field armies, they will enjoy a numerical superiority, but it will not be nearly as great as certainly the Lost Cause Southern apologists will make after the war. And they're also on the offensive, which is weaker. The rule of thought was, you want to be, if you're on the offensive, and especially as field fortifications are coming into play, you need to have a superiority of 2 to 3 to 1. The Union hardly ever enjoys that, except under very rare circumstances. So the military, social, political issues facing the Lincoln administration are huge. There's one final thing I would point out here, and this impinges on the big historiographic conflict that we have discussed, at least in my in-person class, and that is the debate over slavery and American capitalism. So, as some of you have heard, in 2014, Edward Baptist published this book called The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, in which he argues that, Southern plantation slavery was the cutting edge. They were the leading example of capitalism. And they were run on industrial lines. They were innovated. The plantations were run as if they were factories, except they had a lot more tools of brutal enforcement at their disposal. And in fact, slavery accounted for by far the largest proportion of American wealth. This is part of a project called The New History of Capitalism, which is designed, really the purpose of it is to discredit capitalism morally and ethically as a system. And one of the ways that the new capitalist historians have tried to do this is by showing its connections to slavery. The reaction on the part of economic historians has been pretty negative to Baptist's book in particular. Baptist makes some very basic errors in terms of calculating overall wealth. And then these numbers get inflated with other subsequent books that have been published to where slavery accounts for 90% of U.S. wealth, which is simply not accurate. There are some good points about Baptist's book, focusing on the absolute calculated brutality of slavery, which, to a sort of a European historian, well, yes, of course, if you study slavery, you know that the French and the Spanish and the British, they write books about how to be cruel as a way of enforcing discipline. So Baptist's book has some very good strengths to it, but in terms of the economics, his book's been pretty conclusively taken apart. And there's 2 points worth thinking about here. Baptist's book, arguing for this not only are they entwined, but capitalism and slavery are essentially the same. They come from the same, they feed off of each other. He doesn't actually cover the Civil War. He doesn't have to explain why and how if they're this connected and they're the same, and the South provides all this wealth, why they decoupled so quickly with the Lincoln election of Lincoln. He doesn't have to account for that. He doesn't have to explain it. He also doesn't have to explain why, once secession happens, all of a sudden the North is not impoverished. The South is. And this kind of backs up what international observers at the time, even 20 years earlier, say, like most famously Alexis de Tocqueville, noted about the South, that this reliance on slave labor led to a generally undeveloped economy, that this was not a thriving economic area. We're not seeing high levels of productivity, increased standards of living, and so on, except for maybe a very, very few. So The whole process of secession, the election of 1860, secession and mobilization for war, kind of puts a question mark and an exclamation point on a lot of scholarly debates about slavery and its position in the American economy. Because all of a sudden, cut loose from American manufacturers, American financial institutions, and now it's Confederate American financial institutions, such as they are. You see no infrastructure, no industry, not much diversity in food supply, and all the things that traditionally are held to be weaknesses of a system that relies on enslaved labor are immediately apparent. So this is what we have to deal with. I don't think I have anything else. Okay, this is the last point. The railroads I do want to draw attention to. This is railroads in the Confederacy. We've already seen in the previous lecture a map of railroads in the U.S. around 1880. Railroads in the Confederacy are of different gauges, which means different width of track. There's only one line where you can go from Norfolk to Petersburg, to Lynchburg, to Knoxville, to Chattanooga, Decatur, and then, I forgot to color this one, over to Memphis on one rail line. The rest of the time, if you want to move troops and goods across the Confederacy, you're going to have to take them off the trains at some point, put them on a different train, which was on a different level of track, and send them on their way. Over time, the Confederacy, this is one of the interesting things about Davis. The Confederate Congress actually does give Davis almost complete authority over the rails. He doesn't really use it, or he chooses not to use it. Over time, the rails are going to wear down. They're not maintained properly. And you can contrast this with the North, where the U.S. Quartermaster General, Montgomery Meigs, has wide powers, which he uses to encourage Northern railroad companies to comply with U.S. military and government demands. Okay. And one final point, and that is, when is the war going to be over? And this gets back to, I keep coming back to Gallagher, but both two of my favorite historians in the Civil War are Gary Gallagher and Elizabeth Varron, both at UVA. Gallagher's retired. Elizabeth Varron is still very much a presence there. Both of these nation states, or emerging nation states, are, despite various flaws, either quasi or semi-functioning republics or democratic republics. And in a democracy, the people decide when the war is over. The Confederacy runs a bit differently than the United States, but one of the key factors of this conflict is going to be the home front, is going to be overall support for the war. The Lincoln administration, because it has several elections during the war, has a way of gauging this support. The Confederacy does not so much. But at the point that the population decides that the war is over, it will be over. Now, this can be independent of military affairs. So if a nation's armies are beaten in the field, and yet the people refuse to give up, the war isn't over. Everybody knew at the time that the classic example of this was Napoleon's armies in Spain in 1808. This was kind of the classic study of this. It was much remarked upon. Spanish armies might have been not much in evidence for a while. It didn't matter. The people of Spain, by and large, did not accept that the war was over. Guess what? The French were in for a nasty surprise if they assumed the war was over. So, in the U.S., in the United States of America, if Lincoln's voted out of office in 1964, you can be pretty sure the war will be over. The Confederacy, well, you have to look for other signs. How many, are you encountering resistance? Are you encountering pro-unionist sentiment, or even worse yet, counter-revolution, if you will? Are desertions increasing? What's the mood of the women of the South? We'll see when we get to 65. One explanation for the Confederate defeat is that the women of the South, the white women of the South, said, enough. Get back home. You've served, but it's over. These are all the questions that these respective governments have to keep in mind as they prepare for the coming conflict, which everyone hoped and thought would be short, but they're quickly disabused of that. All right, that's what we'll cover next time.